Dear colleagues, now we start a presentation of the report on media monitoring on disinformation about Ukraine. Our speaker, Eugene Czolij, head of the Permanent International Media Monitoring Mission on disinformation about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora.
I welcome all the participants and viewers of this virtual press conference. My name is Eugene Czolij, and I'm the president of NGO Ukraine 2050, head of the Permanent International Media Monitoring Mission on disinformation about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora, and past president of the Ukrainian World Congress. I have the honor to present today the third report of the Permanent International Media Monitoring Mission on disinformation about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora. Disinformation is part of Russia's arsenal of weapons in its genocidal war against Ukraine and hybrid aggression against the West. The Kremlin uses a powerful disinformation machine that spreads through a wide network of propaganda resources, actively attempting to justify its all-out war against Ukraine, discredit Ukraine, its government, army, and people, as well as weaken support for Ukraine abroad. In view of this, Ukraine and its 20 million strong Ukrainian diaspora must make every effort to counter such disinformation and ensure that the international community forms its opinions and makes its decisions about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora on the basis of accurate information. To help achieve these goals, on January 25, 2021, NGO Ukraine 2050 launched the Permanent International Media Monitoring Mission on disinformation about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora, which monitors the media, social networks, and other information resources in various countries in the world for disinformation about Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora, analyzes the findings of these monitoring, and takes measures to help counter such disinformation. Our mission has 169 members from 56 countries who are doing media monitoring on a voluntary basis in 42 languages of the world since June 4, 2021. Since our mission aims to sensitize the general public and to raise awareness of disinformation, we conducted 3 online training sessions on disinformation in Ukrainian on March 27 and October 20th, 2021, and in English on May 15, 2021. These online training sessions were recorded and can be viewed on the NGO Ukraine 2050 YouTube channel. The first report of our mission was officially presented on August 31, 2021, and covered the period from June 4, 2021, the official start of the work of the mission, to August 24, 2021, the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's renewed independence. The second report of our mission was officially presented on August 24, 2022, and covered the period from August 24, 2021, until the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Today's report covers the period from February 24, 2022, the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, until February 24, 2023. This report highlights the information base that was being generated by Russian propaganda during Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine. The report contains a list of identified disinformation narratives, which were grouped into meta-narratives to provide a better understanding of the bigger picture of Russia's information war against Ukraine. 7 disinformation meta-narratives are presented, including their purpose and a list of disinformation narratives of which they consist. The first meta-narrative: NATO, led by the USA and with the support of the West, is the aggressor that started the war against Russia in Ukraine. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at shifting the responsibility for the war in Ukraine to the US and NATO, as well as discrediting the West and disrupting its unity. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. 1. The West, being under the control of transnational corporations, seeks to destroy Russia and the Russian language and culture. 2. The US installed and supports a neo-Nazi puppet regime in Kyiv, starting with the US organized coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. 3. Since 2014, the USA and NATO have been preparing for military aggression against Russia, taking advantage of Ukraine. 4. With the support of the USA, the development of biological and chemical weapons for use against Russia was carried out in a network of secret laboratories on the territory of Ukraine. The USA and NATO turned the civil conflict in Ukraine into a full-scale war of the West against Russia. 6. The USA and NATO are responsible for the unleashing of the war in Ukraine. 7. Russia is actually fighting against NATO in Ukraine since Ukraine is occupied by NATO. 8. The USA and NATO are not interested in establishing peace in Ukraine. 9. Poland intends to occupy the western regions of Ukraine. 10. Western sanctions against Russia are illegitimate, and the confiscation of Russian assets by the West is theft. 11. The West indulges in Nazism by supporting Ukraine. 12. The EU is politically dependent on the USA and is unable to act independently, in particular with regard to Ukraine. 13. The US seeks to destroy the EU's relations with Russia in order to weaken the EU's energy security and economic well-being. 14. The US may have used a secret geophysical weapon that caused the earthquakes in Turkey. 15. Russia can use nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine because it is a war for Russia's survival. Second meta-narrative. Ukraine is a neo-Nazi, aggressive, and artificial state. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at discrediting Ukraine, dehumanizing its government, army, and population, denying Ukraine's right to exist, and thus justifying Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. Ukraine is ruled by Nazis. 2. The armed forces of Ukraine is an army of Nazis and fascists. 3. The majority of the population of Ukraine is a victim of Ukrainian Nazi propaganda. 4. Ukraine needs denazification. 5. Ukraine committed genocide of Donbas residents, particularly by shelling Donbas for 8 years. 6. For years, the West has been loading up Ukraine with weapons, which is why it needs demilitarization. 7. Ukraine was planning to attack Belarus in February 2022. 8. Ukraine was planning an offensive operation in Crimea and Donbas in March 2022. 9. Ukraine attempted to build nuclear weapons and was developing chemical and biological weapons. 10. Russia's so-called special military operation was a necessary measure of self-defense against a planned Ukrainian aggression. 11, Ukraine is an artificial state created by Lenin. 12, the Ukrainian language is a Polonized Russian dialect. 13, Ukraine has no historical rights to the northern Black Sea region, namely the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia, and Mykolaiv oblasts, most of the Kherson, Kirovohrad, Odessa, and Donetsk Oblast, and the Crimean Peninsula. Russia is not occupying the independent state of Ukraine, but is liberating historically Russian territories from the neo-Nazi regime in Kyiv. The third meta-narrative. The West is making a mistake by providing weapons and other aid to Ukraine, as well as by imposing sanctions against Russia. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at undermining the West's trust in Ukraine, intimidating the West with Russia's prognosed consequences of such a policy, and disrupting the supply of military and other aid to Ukraine. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. There's a civil war in Ukraine being fought by two sides of the Russian people. 2, with the West providing weapons to Ukraine, the war is being prolonged, which only results in more victims among the civilian population and migrants from Ukraine to the EU. 3, Ukraine resells weapons obtained as part of military aid from the West. 4, the military aid given to Ukraine by the West is used by the armed forces of Ukraine to kill the civilian population of Donbass. 5, Western countries are no longer willing nor able to help displaced Ukrainians. 6, sanctions against Russia harm the West more than Russia. Fourth meta-narrative. Ukraine commits war crimes and acts of terrorism against its own population and organizes demonstrations of mass casualties of the civilian population in order to blame Russia. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at blaming Ukraine for war crimes and terrorist attacks carried out by Russia, as well as discrediting the evidence against Russia and denying its involvement. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. 1, the Ukrainian military systematically bombards the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which creates a danger of nuclear disaster. 2, Ukraine uses nuclear power plants as warehouses for storing weapons and ammunition. 3, the drama theater in Mariupol, where there was a bomb shelter for the civilian population, was blown up by the Ukrainian Azov. It is a Ukrainian missile that hit the railway station in Kramatorsk. 5, the rocket attack on the trade center in Kremenchuk was a provocation by the armed forces of Ukraine to lay blame on Russia and obtain more weapons from the West. 6, Ukraine shelled the Russian-controlled colony in Olenivka on that Donetsk region, where Ukrainian prisoners of war were held, so as to discourage the Ukrainian military from surrendering, or according to another version, so that the Ukrainian prisoners of war would not testify about Ukraine's war crimes. 7, Ukraine initiated productions with actors and mannequins to create a picture of mass casualties among the civilian population after the withdrawal of the Russians from Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other regions. 8, a residential building in Dnipro was hit by a missile belonging to the Air Defense Forces of Ukraine on January 14, 2023. 9, measures that the West refers to as the forced displacement and filtration of the population in the territories of Ukraine seized by Russia are actually measures to register Ukrainian refugees. 10. Missiles hitting civilian infrastructure and residential buildings are consequences of unsuccessful attempts by Ukrainian air defense missile systems to shoot down Russian missiles aimed exclusively at military targets. 11. Educational institutions, hospitals, cultural monuments, residential buildings, other objects of civilian infrastructure that were destroyed by Russia in Ukraine were used for the deployment of the Ukrainian military or otherwise contributed to the Ukrainian army. 12. Power outages for Ukrainians are less related to Russia's attacks on the energy infrastructure that supports the Ukrainian army and more a result of Ukraine's export of electricity to Europe. 5th meta-narrative. Ukraine bans and oppresses everything Russian. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at creating the impression of oppression in Ukraine of the Russian-speaking population, citizens of Ukraine of Russian descent, Russian language, and culture. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. 1. In Ukraine, it is forbidden to communicate in Russian. 2. Books in Russian were banned in Ukraine. 3. All Russian literature will be removed from Ukrainian libraries. 4. The Russian-speaking population and citizens of Ukraine of Russian descent are discriminated against in Ukraine. 5. Mobilization in Ukraine is being realized primarily among the Russian-speaking population and mainly in Russian-speaking regions. 6. Meta-narrative. Russia is a humane state, firmly defending its interests. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at presenting Russia's actions in Ukraine as legitimate and entirely humane and supported by the Ukrainian population. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. The majority of Ukrainians support the Russian so-called special operation and expect liberation, except for a small percentage of Ukrainian nationalists. 2. Russia attacks only military objects and nothing threatens the civilian population. 3rd, the armed forces of Ukraine are the only threat to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is protected by the Russians. 4. Ukraine turned Mariupol into ruins, whereas Russia will restore the city. 5. It is not Russia, but Ukraine that is disrupting the organization of green corridors for the evacuation of the population and the supply of humanitarian aid. 6. Russia's withdrawal from the Zmyiny Island is a Russian gesture of goodwill to demonstrate Russia's assistance in organizing a humanitarian corridor for export of Ukrainian grain. 7. The retreat of the Russian military from the Kharkiv region and Kherson is a gesture of goodwill to demonstrate that Russians are willing to resolve the conflict through diplomacy. 8. The majority of Ukrainian refugees seek asylum in Russia. 9. Russia does not carry out forced deportations of the population from Ukraine. People are evacuated voluntarily. 10. Russia tries to minimize civilian casualties, and as a result, the Russian offensive periodically slows down. 11. The residents of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions have the right to self-determination in accordance with the UN Charter, The referendums held in these regions are legal, voting was carried out voluntarily, and the majority of the population in the regions supports joining Russia. 7, Russia is the last pillar of spirituality in Europe and a capable leader of the global movement against Western neo-colonialism. This is a disinformation meta-narrative of Russian propaganda aimed at presenting Russia's extraordinary messianic role. Within this meta-narrative, the following disinformation narratives were recorded. 1, Russia is fighting against Western neo-colonialism and has the support of a large part of the world. 2, Russia is saving the world from the satanic rampage and absence of spirituality of the West. 3rd, the Ukrainian regime is destroying orthodoxy by oppressing the only canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. 4, Ukraine needs de-satanization because it has abandoned Orthodox values and indulges in numerous religious sects. 5, Russia is forced to defend Donbass, Ukraine, and the world geopolitical order, which has been violated by the West, and as such, Russia defends its right to exist and preserve traditional moral values. Ladies and gentlemen, our mission continues its work by monitoring and analyzing Russian disinformation during Russia's ongoing genocidal war against Ukraine, the results of which the mission will present in its next report. All relevant information regarding our mission is available in the media section on the website of NGO Ukraine 2050. Thank you for your attention. I'm now ready to answer any questions.
Thank you.